Hey there. So one of the things I want to do is kind of go through um, this little different videos on different kind of topics. This isn't the clickbaity stuff that normally gets through. It's more of a review on just some interesting things that are sent my way. Uh, and one of these is a Tucker Carlson interview with a gentleman by the name of Richard Werner. As I like to do in these things, I can't stand Tucker Carlson unless I hear of his. Fortunately, he doesn't actually talk much in this interview, so I'm really just going to set aside anything Tucker Carlson has to say. Just focus on Richard Werner, and as always, I like to find out who these people are. From what I've read and heard on this interview, obviously he's stupidly intelligent guy. Um, and here is his Wikipedia page to go along with kind of who this guy is. Where does he come from? His early life really isn't explained. He's a doctor in philosophy and economics and conferred by Oxford. He earned a bachelor's of science in economics at the London School of Economics in 1989. Post-grad at Oxford. He spent a year in Japan, University of Tokyo. But what he is most well known for is the book Princes of the Yen and his quantity theory of credit, which I believe he discusses in this video. And he was also the developer, the guy who came up with the idea of quantitative easing, which we know was the Fed monetary policy through the Great Recession that we all had the privilege of living through. I guess privilege is now a thing you can say about something negative now. I did find this interesting though, because he does bring some of this up, and I'll get into my thoughts on subject matter experts here later on. But in 2019, Werner took out a discrimination case against his employer, Southampton University, claiming he was discriminated against and victimized in a harassment and bullying campaign for being both German and Christian during his 14 years at the university. The 2.5 million payout was one of the largest awards ever made by a British tribunal, and was so high because the university failed to defend itself. So basically, they laughed it off and didn't even show up. In July 2019, after a successful appeal by the university, the judgment was set aside and the case was set to proceed in the usual fashion. Werner was then, in August 2020, granted permission to appeal the decision in the Employment Appeal Tribunal. In the meantime, Werner also brought a discrimination claim against the University of Cambridge after they withdrew a conditional offer of employment in 2018. Here's that part. Jump in here on this video, and we're gonna kind of gloss through the pleasantries. We kind of already know who the guy is. We're just gonna go right to what his theory is here.
But actually, if you look into it, you realize there's three theories of banking. A second theory, slightly older, that was dominant until the 1960s, so-called fractional reserve theory. And you may have heard this fractional reserve banking. What is that? Well, this theory says, and this part is similar, each bank is a financial intermediary. It just collects deposits and then does the analysis, lends out the money. But in aggregate, as banks interact, there's money creation. Oh, and that's where students' ears should have pricked up. Money creation. They even talk about a money multiplier. What? That's the second theory. Now there's a third theory. And that one had been made out to be a wacky conspiracy theory.
Oh.
But it is the one that was more or less quite widely known until about a century ago.
Mm.
And that's the credit creation theory of banking. And this one says banks are not financial intermediaries. Banks are special. They have a unique power that no other player in the economy has, and that is the power to create money. And actually that theory had been called all sorts of names like, this is kooky people and, cranks. Keynes said in his general theory, or it was the treatise on money, these are the cranks who talk about the banks creating money.
I think the average person believes the ability to create money is reserved for governments alone.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, I did a survey with my students in Frankfurt in 2011. My audience was getting larger when I was teaching at Goethe University Frankfurt. It was only sort of for a few years substitute professor, optional courses. So the first one was only 50 students, but next one was already 150. In the end, it was 450. Everyone was there, also from politics and law. And so I thought, this is a great audience. Listen, guys, let's use these numbers. Let's do a survey. So I sent them out, because if you've got so many people, then if everyone does 10 questionnaires, you're talking big numbers. So we did a survey of central Frankfurt. And one of the questions asked was just this question: who do you think creates and allocates the majority of the money supply in the economy? And to make it easier, here's multiple choice answers. The government, the central bank, the financial markets, the banks, and so on. Give a few options. or savings, people through their savings, which is another economic theory. So, and the answer was, just as you said, and you spoke the facts, 84% responded either the government or the central bank are the ones that create and allocate the majority of the money supply. Because that's common sense. It's something very important that clearly affects everything and everyone. It should be in the hands of the government. It's what people feel. But it's not true. That's not how it works. And so what is the answer? Well, of these three theories of banking, which one is correct? Well, what's the scientific thing to do? Is to do an empirical test. That's what a scientist would do. But it turns out I was the first to do an empirical test of the three theories of banking.
Empiricism and economics? I didn't know that happened.
Exactly.
You ran experiments and replicated them? I thought that was...
Exactly. Well, you can do empirical tests. The replication is debated whether you can always replicate it. But certainly you can test. You can do tests. And we can certainly control for certain things. And that's what I did. And I thought it's crazy that, you had for over a century this debate between these three theories, but nobody had actually done the scientific thing. So let's find out. Let's just test with the data and observation which of the theories is in line with the data and which is rejected by the data. Now, to do this, I needed a bank that would cooperate. And my plan was, I'm going to take out a bank loan and we're going to watch inside the box, inside the bank's accounting system, how are they accounting for this and what transactions are taking place when I take out my loan. The intermediation theory says deposits get lent out. The fractional reserve theory says that the bank needs to have excess reserves at the central bank and that's then used for the new loan.
Yes.
And the credit creation theory, you know what it says? It says when you get a loan, no money is transferred to you. It's transferred away from anywhere else. And you just credited new money out of nothing that is not transferred away anywhere inside or outside the bank, which seems, quite sort of extreme.
Like magic.
In fact, the convention is to use Latin for this. The money is created ex nihilo, out of nothing. So when it did the empirical test, the conclusion was the financial intermediation theory is rejected and the fractional reserve theory is rejected. Banks create money out of nothing. By the way, you can look it up. It's the most downloaded paper of all Elsevier publications and it's open access. So, can banks individually create money out of nothing?
Any bank. Just to be clear, not just central banks.
Any bank. In fact, that's the whole point. We're talking about normal banks. With central banks, it wouldn't be a surprise.
But the Bank of Omaha can
any bank creates money. When you take out a loan, the money that you're given as the borrower didn't previously exist. It is net new purchasing power that is being created and added to the money supply. And that's how the system works. Now, to understand how the system works is a precondition for having good economic analysis and good policy recommendations. And that explains for over 100 years, macroeconomics has made no progress. They have no banks in there. They have no bank credit creation in there. When the 2008 crisis happened and the journalists, I'm sure yourself also, want to ask some experts. Let's go to MIT professor of economics. What's going on? Lehman Brothers gone bust. Banks are going bust. Bank of America in trouble.
what's happening? The honest answer of all the professors of economics would have been, well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Why not? You're the expert. Aren't you at MIT? Aren't you an economist? Yes, certainly. Well, why can't you answer? Well, we have no banks in our models. So, of course, I can't talk about banks.
That would be the correct answer. Of course, they didn't give that answer.
No,
they're fudging it. They're pretending because they don't want the public to know.
No one ever admits ignorance. But may I ask how? I'm not an economist. I'm interested, but I did not know until you just told me that banks play no role in economic models.
No, they're not in there. So when the 2008 crisis happened, the central banks were using the so-called DSGE models. This is a huge, complicated sounding name. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which sounds very sophisticated. There's some like super bright rocket scientists in there with complex models. Well, the whole thing is nonsense from start to finish, and it doesn't include any banks whatsoever. And it's built on really pretty crazy assumptions that are true, perhaps on some remote planet in some very far away solar system, certainly not in ours, and certainly nothing to do with planet Earth.
I just think, as a non-expert, the idea that banks would play no role, would not be included in an economic model, a macroeconomic model, seems insane because the experience of every person living in the world includes banks.
That's right. That's right. And the trick was to argue, well, we don't need them because, you see, they're just an intermediary. They're not really important.
Role, right.
So, yes, they exist, and we all know there's banks, but they don't change anything.
The money just goes through one-to-one, in here, out there. There's no reason to include them. Oh, we include the bond market. Oh, and we include interest rates. So that's all we need. By the way, that's the second big myth I busted in economics. You know, this idea that interest rates drive the economy.
Yes.
And they're the key variable. And of course, even today, I mean, every central banker, every market commentator,
every TV show, exactly.
Investor,
every president, by the way.
And it's a daily thing. It's mentioned. And it's, everyone's supposed to, is this presupposed knowledge that if we lower rates, this will stimulate the economy. If we raise rates, this will slow the economy. And it's been said in the last 50 years, I don't know how many thousand times by all these people. Well, I can ask you, what's your guess? How many empirical, data-based, fact-based studies exist that demonstrate this? That actually demonstrate that, look, here's the data. Yes, we lower rates. It leads to higher growth. We raise rates. It slows growth.
I would assume none because I've never met anyone who doubts it. It's like gravity. We just
you don't even need to test it.
Well, of course not. We know it's true. It's obvious. I thought that until right now.
Yeah, it's so true. This is called an axiom, by the way. Yes. An axiom is something that is so true, we never have to check whether it is true. Right. and if we did check whether it's true, we'd find it's not true.
But we wouldn't believe the results because we know it's true.
Yeah,
doesn't matter. You can't disprove it.
Yeah. Well, in fact, this is you've described now the methodology of the dominant mainstream economics, which is the hypothetical axiomatic deductive methodology, where you pose an axiom that you know to be true, so you don't have to check whether it is true, and if you did check, it's not true. It would be the result, and then you add assumptions which you admit are simplifications, heroic assumptions, which are, yes, we know they're not true, but it doesn't matter. And then you build your model on it. And that's the approach they use. Now, this approach is particularly useful if you have a predetermined conclusion you'd like to come to, because then you can actually start out with your preferred conclusion, work backwards, then define what assumptions do I need to pose this model, what axiom do I need to present this, and then the key step, present in reverse order. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just, for sake of argument, assume these and these things. Oh, look at this. The model is telling us, interest rates, lower rates lead to higher growth and higher rates lead to low growth. We don't need to look at banking. It's totally uninteresting. Don't go there. Move on. Nothing to see here.
What you're saying is, I believe that there are a lot of people who just never thought that option 3, your description of banks, the bank credit creation, could be a meaningful factor. They just never thought of it. But there had to have been a lot of people who realized this before the 1990s. So if it's not publicly known, it sounds like it was hidden.
Absolutely. Oh, certainly. Well, actually, so I've got 2 papers on this. One is the Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing? The other one is called Lost Century in Economics, about these past 100 years.
They must hate you. You're a fellow economist. Sorry to interrupt. They must hate you.
And I do go through the literature and the sort of history of economic thought. And there's some very curious things happening. So, for example, there's John Maynard Keynes, and many people would say, well, he's certainly the most famous economist of the 20th century.
That's for
certainly
sure.
the one who's quoted a lot, cited a lot, and had some policy influence and so on. Now, when you look at his writings with the topic of credit creation, bank credit creation, his development is kind of curious. So when he was young, he discovered it. There's a book by him from 1924 in which the book was on something else, but he stumbled on this and he writes, I'm paraphrasing, something like, and look up my papers, then you'll see the exact quote, but he was writing like, oh, the bank's actually adding to the money supply through their activities. That's a very important fact that changes everything. I will return to this later. That sort of thing. It's something that will have to be examined further. That's very important. Well, 6 years later, in his important book, Treatise on Money, 2 volumes, he had moved from the credit creation theory that he clearly had discovered in 1924 to the fractional reserve theory. He was saying, oh, banks are just intermediaries, but yes, in the system, the interaction is creating some money. 6 years later, he published the famous general theory. And in that general theory, he'd moved on to the financial intermediation theory. Now it is, again, the savers who need to save money and then deposit it, and that is then lent out by the banks. There's no money creation.
So, in other words, he progressed away.
Regressed, exactly.
Regressed, thank you. So with each successive theory, he obscured the role of the banks ever more.
Now, interestingly, his financial wealth increased proportionately. And by the last stage...
people have stayed this long in the conversation. These are really interesting, and you're a great explainer.
US and world history. The Fed was created on the pretext, on the main argument.
Okay, I'm going to hop back on here and kind of unpack some of that. So the 3 theories of money creation. I had learned some of this. Fractional reserve is kind of what I've known. And even on his theory, keep in mind, at this point, we're shortly after he discusses his 3 theories of banking, and we'll just unpack the 3 theories right now. Well, actually, the last 2, his and the fractional theory. So the fractional theory, as I understand, is that if I deposit $100 into the bank, that bank has $100 deposited. I get a bank statement. I get all the information that my money is there. And that bank then goes out and loans money to other people, businesses, people, consumer loans, construction loans, et cetera, et cetera. And fractional reserve means that the bank has to keep a certain percentage of the deposits in reserve. And so far, nothing he has said yet discredits this perspective, by the way. If it's 20%, and this the reserve that a bank must keep is set by statute. It's regulated. So if it's, for ease of sake, 25%. So out of the $100 that I put in, $75, the bank only has to hold $25 in reserve. So they can then loan out $75 of that. And that's it. I mean, that they've created money. Because my initial deposit is still there. They loan out $75 of that. So 3 people get $25 a piece out of my 100. But my money is still there. So that money is just credited to their account, and now suddenly the bank has created $75. As long as, and this is where the reserve comes in, all 4 of us do not go and try and remove our money at the same time. At that point, they have an issue. I think I might be simplifying a little bit. I might even be wrong. But that was my understanding of it, is that is the reserve. If it's 25%, that's all they have to hold up in reserve is 25% of their loans outstanding. And that's to prevent bank runs. In his version of it, there is no reserve. There's no reserve. The bank, if I put $100 in, the bank can loan out $300, and that's $300 created. Just money that exists out of nowhere, because of accounting, the way the accounting works, in that the deposit is viewed as a asset and the loan is viewed as an asset. So, and when a bank gives out a loan, they don't just give you cash, they just credit data into your account. So that money never really exists until someone goes into deposit it and they get a physical form of currency, like dollar bills or something of that nature. That's in fractional reserve and his view. What's interesting, though, is that when he starts to explain his theory of banking here, he never addresses that part of it. And I'm interested to read his paper to see if he addresses it there, because even in his view, in his model, that banks create money, which I actually don't disagree with. I actually think he's completely correct. However, he glosses over the idea that they create money out of thin air. They use a Latin term. I don't speak Latin, or very little. So we're dealing with men of the people here. They both understood the Latin on this one. But even in his view of money creation, it's actually, this is kind of funny because it's Schrodinger's money. I've actually had to use that term more in the last 3 months than I have in the last 10 years. The money both exists and doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist until it's observed. So the money does not exist. So when I say Schrodinger's money, is if everybody the bank loans money out to, this created money, goes to the bank and tries to withdraw it as cash, suddenly that money has to exist in the real world. Then it's accounted for. Then it gets put on the ledger. So he's correct in my view, and I'm absolutely could be wrong, but he's very correct in that banks create money right up until the point that people withdraw it. It's basically fictional money created out of thin air until it becomes existent in the real world in some fashion. And that probably gets into where he's talking about here.
Because there's lots of doubters who didn't want the Fed. It's very un-American, was the general view. And they were very sneaky to actually get the Fed and get the law passed. They used some of the rules on how you can schedule a vote, and they went for the most obscure over and buy big banks, bigger banks, and banks that were part of the Fed cartel. But to lose 10,000 banks is just such a setback for the economy.
True. Of course, there's policies against that you could do. But the argument was, well, the best is to have a central bank because they can provide endless liquidity through money printing, which is, internal money, reserves, or if needed, if they want cash, the central bank provides the cash, paper notes, and therefore this good bank will not go bust. And that is sort of convincing. But when it came to that, beginning of the Great Depression, what did the Fed do? It let more than 10,000 banks go bust. In the nastiest way. These were banks that were small, lending to local businesses, to the farmers in particular, and they let them go bust. Now, in the 1920s, there was mechanization of agriculture, tractors and so on. So there's expensive equipment, and banks were giving the loans, the farmers were taking the loans. Now these banks were bust. Well, they were taken over and by big banks, bigger banks, and banks that were part of the Fed cartel. But to lose 10,000 banks is just such a setback for the economy. Unbelievable. Now you'd think, oh, good for the farmers, at least they're out of these loans. No. Number one, when the banks went bust, there was no deposit insurance.
these families, these farmers, these small businesses, they all lost and their personal savings. All that money they had in the bank was gone. That wasn't refunded. Okay. Number two, you think they'd be off the hook from their loans? No. The banks were then taken over, bought cheaply, and they still had to repay the loans, but they had nothing left, and they were destitute.
Wait, you lose your deposit but keep your debt?
Yes, that's
How does that work?
That's a Federal Reserve policy. Of course, the Fed could have, done it very differently and
Where
certainly
was
saved those
President
banks.
Roosevelt in this, the man of the people?
Well, the banking systems, once you set up a central bank that's not controlled by the people, then you're in the hands of the central bank. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is 100% privately owned, and that is really the center where all the decisions are made. You have the Washington board of the Fed, but that's a political.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it there to unpack a little bit of that statement, because this is the type of thing that bothers me about subject matter experts. So there are a few things here that are absolutely shaded over. So subject matter experts. Richard Werner is honestly brilliant, I think, probably in economics. Right, the guy is very smart. We have a real problem in our society in assuming because someone is good at one thing or very smart in one thing, they have the capability of switching around and being very smart in other things. Now, he's clearly researched bank failures and stuff like that in the Great Depression. He's researched the history of the Federal Reserve. He's researched, but with subject matter experts, he researched something in a very narrow fashion. He didn't look at the entire ecosystem of what occurred in the Great Depression. It was it was a high interest of mine a while ago, and I read many books on the Great Depression. What he's glossing over, or I don't want to ascribe willfully glossing over, is that yes, there was a Federal Reserve System. Yes, there were banks that were part of it, but a lot of these 10,000 banks were privately held banks. And one of the things that privately held rural banks did back then was they issued their own script. So when you deposited your money in one of these banks, you got back a bank deposit slip, which then was good for around. It's very similar to company script. If you remember it's an old song. I'm familiar with it. Work 18 hours and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. I don't know what I've been told, but I sold my soul to the company store. Okay, so that was a literal thing. Companies would pay workers in company script or company currency that could then only be used at the company store, which is the general store where everybody who worked for the company went and bought things from, because that was the only place you could use your pay. And it's roughly, to put it in modern terms, it'd be like you go to Costco and you go to pay for your groceries, old-timey word, groceries, and you hand the cashier dollar bills, and in exchange, the cashier gives you Costco dollars. Okay, and you're like, oh, well, whatever, I'll take the Costco dollars. But here's where it breaks down. Then you happen to have to go to Walmart because Costco didn't have something, right? You go to Costco, so I don't know. But here Costco has everything, but you never know. So you go to Walmart and you grab your things and you go to pay and you hand them your Costco bucks. And the cashier looks at you and says, I can't take these. We only accept Wally World dollars. Oh, okay. That was what was happening back then. You would deposit in a bank and you'd get a currency or a deposit slip for that bank that was not honored by other banks because they were privately held. There might be one bank for the town, and then a couple towns over, you couldn't use that deposit slip to get anything. You'd have to, so when you traveled, you'd actually have to remove your money and take it. And that's where actually stagecoach robberies come from. If you remember, like movies and everything else, is that Wells Fargo or some other form of stagecoach or transport company would have to take currency from town to town to town in order to supply for these private banks. And he's glossing over this idea because that's primarily why the banks went out of business, primarily why people lost all their money is because they had their money in these privately held banks that then loaned it out in kind of a fractional reserve basis. And then there was a run on the bank and they didn't have enough cash to handle the withdrawals. So what actually happened is they had to call the loans in. There were on loans, particularly to farmers and everything else, there were provisions in there, like a force majeure type thing, where the bank could call the loan in. But then the bank was left with all the equipment and land. And of course, they couldn't do anything with it. The bank was bankrupt. The bank had no money. It lent out all the money, or people removed their deposits. So the bank didn't have anything. And a lot of banks, the initial capital for the bank came from private individuals, and that's where the money to handle the deposits or the loans and everything else to do the bank operations came from, and they went bankrupt. So it was a cascading failure because of that system. Now, he's right. I mean, these banks served local companies. Then bigger banks came in and bought the assets of the bank, which included the equipment for the farm loans. So the farmers couldn't farm and they no longer owned the land. So that's where all these destitute farmers and everything else came from. It's not necessarily that the loans were still in existence. It was just that the loans had already been called and the assets collected, and the farmer no longer owned the assets. So he didn't own the land. The bank had already called the note, or they'd called the note on the equipment. So that's why that happened, not necessarily that a bigger bank came in and bought the bankrupt smaller bank, and this big bad Fed bank came in and bought this smaller bank that was bankrupt and stiffed the farmers. It was normal. I hate to say it's just business. It was just business. The bank called the loan in order to get the cash in order to continue operations and failed, but it obviously had the assets because the assets were a loan. So yeah, the loan had already been called. The farmer didn't own the land or the equipment anymore. So when a bigger bank came up and bought the other bank on bankruptcy or liquidation, it obviously owned those assets. Now, in some cases, a wealthy farmer could go back and, repurchase his equipment or could have paid off the loan. There are some instances of that, but it all hinges on these banks were not part of any system and they were unregulated. So they could issue bank credit. They didn't, some banks held more in reserve than others, and that's how the entire system collapsed. Now, Tucker Carlson asked what is really a dumb question is, where was Franklin Roosevelt, man of the people? Well, to be quite honest, he wasn't elected yet. He was not president when this was occurring. The bank crash happened in 1929. All right. They raised tariffs to try to save the faltering economy, but already there were runs on banks because with stock market crash, people wanted their money. That was the initial bank run. That was the part of the cause of the crash, of the stock market crash in 1929, was bank runs. So Tucker Carlson's being very freaking disingenuous on this. It was, where's Roosevelt? He wasn't elected until 1930. Hold on. I want to make sure I got this right. He wasn't elected until 1933, well into the Great Depression. And once Roosevelt was in office, he implemented actions to save the banks. The FDIC was a big one to restore confidence in the banking system because people kept money in their mattresses and didn't want to put money into banks because of those bank runs and those banking collapses. And the FDIC is essentially the government will guarantee your deposit at an FDIC certified bank up to $100,000. So you can have trust that your money, when you deposit in the bank, regardless of what happens to that bank, your money will be safe. You'll still be able to withdraw it out. And that's that's all it was in order to restore confidence in the banking system because of all these banking collapses where people could not physically withdraw their money. So again, that was kind of that whole segment was rather either a very narrow focus looking at a historical event in the framework that you've already decided that it was, or ascribing nefarious purposes to it when there is a whole hemisphere of context going on there that you're discarding in order to fit a narrative, and on Tucker Carlson's side, pure lying, just flat out lying. He knows better. He's Stanford, Harvard educated. Now we'll move on to the gold section. This one will be interesting to me.
And it just continued. So then the French literally sent, well, first they said to the Fed, okay, we're going to change these dollars into gold. And initially Fed reaction, well, certainly it's not a problem. It's all above board, very transparent. We will, okay, how much you want to switch? Just say the number. Okay, this much, fine. We will now switch it with this gold from our gold reserves into your account with us. So
your account.
In other words, it's just another bank transaction. Okay, well, this is your gold now. Of course, we'll keep it. It's very safe with us. We'll keep it in custody. So step number 2 was then when the French decided, there's Pompidou, there's Charles de Gaulle. They decided, well, hang on, we better get the gold because it doesn't really change much if they just switch the label of the account who's holding the gold. So, and they literally sent their Navy battleships to Manhattan. They docked in Manhattan, and they, captain and his sailors walked to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they took out the gold. Now this the Americans couldn't allow to happen too often.
No.
And it was kept low profile, but it was beginning to become a story. And if others followed, so then August 1971, President Richard
Nixon. Did the
Nixon,
French get the gold?
They got some gold. Yeah, this really happened. This did happen. They sent their ships. They walked to the Federal Reserve and from their dock in Manhattan. They got the gold. I guess they had some trolleys because it's really heavy, that stuff. And they wheeled it back to their ship. But not long after, the Fed and the Treasury advised President Nixon, look, you better make an announcement. What announcement? Well, that we have to protect the dollar from speculators. That's what he announced. We're going to strengthen the dollar by protecting it against speculation, by severing now how did you say I love this. We're temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, of course, it's now 51 years of
54
years, yes. Crazy.
Amazing. Did the introduction, speaking of gold, of fiat currency into the West, did it make all of this possible? Like, could a bank create money if it wasn't fiat money?
Banks have always created money. If you go back into the history of banking, it's always been about money creation. That is the secret of banking. And that's also why it's been kept secret until my paper proving it.
But how do you do that if you can't print something worthless and call it valuable? If it's tied to a commodity whose price is set by people you can't control.
Yeah, but that's just marketing. That is just, to build the credibility. It's a marketing tool.
Okay. So here we're going to go right on the gold standard. There's a couple of very interesting things there. Yes, I knew about the French incident. That's great. Of course, Tucker Carlson seems to be, against a fiat currency, and that's fine. But let's unpack a little bit of why gold. First, to 1896, William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech. And it's probably one of the most famous speeches in existence.
Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the convention, I would be presumptuous indeed to present myself against the distinguished gentlemen to whom you have listened, if this were a mere measuring of abilities. But this is not a contest between persons. The humblest citizen in all the land, when clad in the arm of a righteous cause, is stronger than all the hosts of error. I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty. the cause of humanity. When this debate is concluded, a motion will be made to lay upon the table the resolution offered in commendation of the administration and also the resolution offered in condemnation of the administration. We object to bringing this question down to the level of persons. The individual is but an atom. He is born, he acts, he dies. But principles are eternal. And this has been a contest over a principle. Never before in the history of this country has there been witnessed such a contest as that through which we have just passed. Never before in the history of American politics has a great issue been fought out as this issue has been by the voters of a great party. On the 4th of March, 1895, a few Democrats, most of them members of Congress, issued an address to the Democrats of the nation, asserting that the money question was the paramount issue of the hour, declaring that a majority of the Democratic Party had the right to control the action of the party on this paramount issue, and concluding with the request that the believers in the free coinage of silver in the Democratic Party organize, take charge of, and control the policy of the Democratic Party. 3 months later at Memphis, an organization was perfected, and the Silver Democrats went forth openly and courageously proclaiming their belief and declaring that if successful, they would crystallize into a platform the declaration which they had made. Then began the conflict, with a zeal approaching the zeal which inspired the crusaders who followed Peter the Hermit. Our Silver Democrats went forth from victory unto victory until they are now assembled, not to discuss, not to debate, but to interrupt the judgment already rendered by the plain people of this country. In this contest, brother has been arrayed against brother, father against son. The warmest ties of love, acquaintance, and association have been disregarded. Old leaders have been cast aside when they refused to give expression to the sentiments of those whom they would lead. And new leaders have sprung up to give direction to this cause of truth. Thus has the contest been waged, and we have assembled here under as binding and solemn instructions as were ever imposed upon the representatives of the people. When you, turning to the gold delegate, come before us and tell us that we're about to disturb your business interests, we reply that you have disturbed our business interests by your course. We say to you that you have made the definition of a businessman too limited in its application. The man who is employed for wages is as much a businessman as his employer. The attorney in a country town is as much a businessman as the corporation counsel in a great metropolis. The merchant at the crossroads store is as much a businessman as the merchant of New York. The farmer who goes forth in the morning and toils all day, who begins in the spring and toils all summer, and who, by the application of brain and muscle to the natural resources of the country, creates wealth, is as much a businessman as.
I mean, that's kind of get the point. It's text of the speech is widely available. And isn't it just initially? Isn't it just amazing to hear the eloquence to speak as something as simple as the gold standard and bimetallism, substituting silver for gold? But now let's get to the point of the video. Obviously, the gold standard has been an issue for a very long time. One of the reasons is because in order to have a gold standard, you have to have the gold. Gold is a fairly rare substance and is treated as a very valuable metal. In order to have a money supply, you have to have the gold to back it. So the problem with gold was that it tightened and choked the money supply. And as we know from 2009, a choking and low money supply is not a good thing. It was also highly inflationary, and it was hard to predict the inflation because if you reduced the fraction of gold that was available, like let's say you tie the dollar to an ounce of gold or half an ounce of gold instead of an ounce of gold, you've immediately inflated the money supply. That occurs almost instantly. So in order to understand why a fiat currency isn't necessarily a bad thing, let's just go and ask the question, why is gold valuable? It's not necessarily, I mean, it's a fairly useful industrial metal, but we can't use it for industry because it's so much valuable for other things. And it's, other than that, it's a fairly unremarkable, non-reactive metal. That's it. It's a semiconductor. It's a very good semiconductor. But again, we don't use it that often because it's very expensive, and there are other semiconductors that function just as well, but aren't nearly as expensive, such as copper, some other things. They conduct electricity. I mean, gold is really, on the whole, not that great. So why is it so valuable? Because people think it's valuable. That's it. It's a store of wealth. It's a store of value. People think it's value, thus it is value. Diamonds, same way. Cryptocurrency. Let's take cryptocurrency. Why is cryptocurrency valuable? Because people are willing to buy it. That is ultimately the only reason gold exists, and people argue for the gold standard, is it's a widely accepted store of value. So when you go to a fiat currency, what is it backed by? Full faith and credit to the United States. Well, what does that mean? It means nothing. So ultimately, why is money worth money? Because we all say it is. We all collectively agree that this dollar bill is worth something. A quarter is worth something. That's the only reason it's worth anything. Just like gold. If we somehow decided collectively, we woke up one day, we're in a different timeline or something like that, and we all decided that aluminum was as equally valuable as gold, then we would have aluminum-backed currencies. And anyone who lived through the COVID supply chain disruption understands supply-side economics and what happened then. If you have it, it's valuable, and you can charge what you want for it. That's it. That is ultimately the underpinning of our entire economy, is what are you willing to pay me for this? And if I decide that I will accept your dollar as a store of value, then that dollar has value equal to what the item that I'm selling to you is. Same with gold, same with diamonds, same with gemstones. It's all a store of value. And the underpinning of that value is all based on what we collectively agree is valuable or not. If a Ferrari were the same as a Toyota, Ferraris would not be valued as expensive as they are. So their whole segment here boils down to that, but they never discuss it. Now we'll move on to some more esoteric topics that they have.
The next point. In fact, I did a study on the US with my collaborator, former PhD student of mine, because America still has just about the largest number of banks in the world, although the number used to be a multiple.
Yes.
The Fed killed 10,000 banks in the 30s. It killed 10,000 banks, almost 15,000 banks in the post-war era. Central banks want to consolidate and reduce the number of banks, but the more banks, the better for an economy, for the country, for the middle class. What we found in the study is we looked at what is the link between the size of the bank and the size of the borrower, and what we found. I mean, it makes common sense, but it wasn't really demonstrated properly in the research by others yet. It's a simple fact in banking. Big banks want to do big deals with big customers. Makes sense. That's how they earn big money. Who lends to small firms? Only small banks. Now, why are small firms important? They're the biggest employer. Small and medium-sized enterprises employ 65, 70% of everyone in every country in the world. In some countries, it's 70, 80% of employment. When you study finance, and I'm teaching finance in several universities, basically, they focus on companies that issue stocks and shares. Well, that's such a minority. 99.9% of companies don't issue and publicly trade stocks. They're not listed in the stock exchange. They are small firms. Where do they get money from? Small firms, 99% of the companies are small and medium-sized enterprises. They get their money from, internal money, friends and family, yes, but external money is only from banks. Now, which banks? If you have an economy that's mostly dominated by large banks, extreme case is the UK. 5 big banks dominate, the banking system. 85% of deposits with 5 banks, the big 5. Then, because they want to do big deals, they don't lend to small firms. Small firms don't get money.
And that means only big cities survive.
Yes, everything becomes concentrated. Now, Germany...
But it's reflected in demographic trends. It's reflected in wealth allocation.
Exactly.
So, because this is a trend. Like when I was born, 1969, like there was a lot of wealth in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There was a lot of wealth in Des Moines, Iowa. There was Portland, Oregon. It was more diffuse.
Because there were more banks, more local banks. Everything is affected, even fertility, because if everyone, has to move to the big cities where property is more expensive, smaller apartments, small dwellings, can't have another child. So many things in society are actually affected directly by this trend. And this trend has been driven very hard by the central banks. They want to reduce the number of banks. Sometimes it's official, like the ECB. We think Europe is overbanked. There's too many banks. And the ECB is the youngest major central bank. It's only founded around 2000. And it's already managed to kill 6,000 banks in Europe. Wow, well done. So it's very sad. Now, Germany in Europe used to be the country with by far the largest number of banks. And still is the one with the largest number of banks. But in the last 20 years, under ECB pressure through their policies of reducing banks' profit margins, zero interest, negative interest rate policy, and then this over-regulation made life so hard for small banks they had no choice but to merge. That was the goal, and that was achieved. So the number of small banks goes down, and that means banks lend less for productive business investment. The best way to make sure that banks create credit for the best of these 3 scenarios, to make sure they don't lend for real estate or for consumption, but mainly for productive business investment, is to have many, many small banks that lend locally to small firms. And that was the system in Germany.
Okay. This is, now we're cooking with gas. This is right in my wheelhouse here. So I'm going to dispute a couple things. They're not wrong. However, even he will acknowledge so I'm just going to point out a logical fallacy or discrepancy that he actually contradicts himself from earlier. One, the Great Depression was bad because the farmers' mortgages were called, or they still had to pay them, but they didn't have the money to pay the mortgages, so they lost land. Now, a little bit later here, when he's talking about productive loans, he specifically states, how do we prevent banks from loaning for real estate? Right there, he's contradicting himself. We're already discussing it was very bad back in the 30s or 20s, 30s, that mortgages were being foreclosed on and farmers didn't have their land and everything else. But then later on, he's saying, but even then, loans for real estate are bad. They're not productive. They don't generate wealth. I get what he's saying here. All right. Bad loans are for consumption loans. So I get a loan to buy an iPad, or I get a loan to buy a car. That is a consumer loan that is unproductive. That is inflationary, and that's part of why we have inflation, because the bank creates money, creates a money supply for me to buy a car, and it does so all over the place. Then a car becomes more valuable, and thus it becomes inflationary. That's where money supply becomes inflationary in his model. The other is real estate, and real estate by itself is also unproductive and actually not even inflation. It drives up home prices. It depresses wages. Homes become stores of value. They become investments, and they're not like just living places, which ultimately I think is where he's going with that they should. And I mean, if we could just look around and see that that's true. I mean, that is obvious. We have a very low home supply. We have venture capital firms buying up homes and putting them on Airbnb or renting them out, and then they keep jacking up the rents as home values rise, and there's no new supply being built because it's expensive. And we have restrictive building codes that prevent the most efficient way of building houses, which, I mean, we could 3D build a house very quickly now, but building codes prevent it. You can't actually build that and have it to code. There's various ways of doing that. Most of them involve federal building codes as the lowest floor, and then a very concerted effort to harmonize building codes across the country to allow non-site built or modular homes or 3D printed homes to be considered to code. Now, let's get into the other side of that, business loans, which is really what he's talking about here. I'm in full agreement with this. I've advocated, anybody who would sit and listen to me talk for a little bit at all would know, I think the Small Business Administration is a joke. And it's, you literally have to already be profitable in order to get a loan or any type of financial assistance from the Small Business Administration. And of course, the Small Business Administration is run through what? Banks. So not only is that loan guaranteed by the federal government, but the bank profits off it. It is an entirely corrupt and nonsensical system. Now, you can get so much help from the Small Business Administration on doing business plans and setting up your business and everything else, but at the end of the day, the money to start something has to come from a non-bank, non-SBA source, because they're right. Banks will not loan to a startup. They just won't. There's no way. The only way it could possibly happen is if you personal guarantee 110 to 150% of the loan. And then most small businesses fail. That's just a fact. It's not a condemnation of people's ability or anything else, just small businesses fail. 2 out of 3 generally fail within the first 3 years. So when you look at starting a business, which is a primary driver of economic growth, you're looking at somebody taking a risk, a 66% risk, that they're going to lose everything because they've personally guaranteed this loan, or a family member is going to lose everything. That's a hell of a risk. That's, if you were a gambler, you would not take that risk at all. The question is why? And I disagree with Tucker, and I disagree a little bit here. My family is very tied in very closely with our local community bank. It is a small bank that they're talking about, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'd say neither of these two gentlemen spend much time with let's say a president of a small local bank, or board members or whatnot. But these are I grew up in a weird community. These people were right down the street. You could talk banking business there. So let's go into why they are not misrepresenting, but maybe they just don't know because of their positions. They never had to. They don't live in rural towns. They don't. I mean, Tucker Carlson's talking about Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids isn't a small rural town. Portland isn't a small rural town. I don't know what he's talking about with this. So he's talking specifically like the 60s and the 70s, and let's just go to my parents' experience. They wanted to buy their first house. They applied for a loan through the local bank. The bank called 3 references, asked my grandfather, talked to my dad's employer, and within 3 days, they found out that they got the loan because the loan officer of the bank called out from the front of the bank, "Hey, great news, they got approved." That's how they found out they got the loan. There was no credit check. There was no financial reporting company. There was no credit reporting firm or anything else, or balance of accounts or any of that. It was purely based on his employment and personal references. That's how they got their mortgage loan for their first house. Fast forward to today, your FICO score, 3 credit reporting agencies, your W-2s, your income, they want to see all your bank statements and everything else. That's to get a loan approval today versus back then. So when Tucker Carlson's asking what happened and they want to know, like, small community banks, more small community banks isn't going to fix the problem. It's because a small community bank is still going to have the same type of credit limits and credit risk that a large bank is going to look at. So the idea that if we just had more banks, more local banks, there's not going to be an increase in business loans, again, because of the personal guarantees and the loan amounts and everything else. I mean, if you wanted to start a factory today as a startup, venture capital is the only place you could go. And a venture capital firm is never going to invest in manufacturing. So this whole manufacturing renaissance in the United States is just totally, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous concept to even consider. Now, I will give the big, beautiful bill credit. You can depreciate immediately 100% of any capital improvements to an existing factory or startup. But again, who's going to loan that initial seed money or the cash outlay? Most manufacturing in this country is owned by private equity firms that are fatally allergic to cash outlays. Fatally allergic to cash outlays. The underpinning of all this is related to how we handle business loans and how we handle punishing people for failure. When it's baked into the cake that there's a 66 to 70% failure rate. So who would take the risk? Nobody. That's why the only business creation we really have in this country are what would be, it's not derogatory, but what would be termed small business, like very small business, restaurants, things that a skilled person can do in a very small location and generate a client base. But it's not manufacturing. It is not creating goods. It's services. It's all service related. It's a restaurant. It's a barbershop, beauty salon, massage parlor. It's those type of things. It's not going to be I'm going to start my own plastics company, injection molds, or something like that. The money is not there for those. And unless there's some serious structural changes to the way we do things, it never will be. And that's why it was very heartened to hear it actually being brought up as a concern, is how do we generate small business growth or creation in this country, and not just restaurants and HVAC companies and the like, but actual manufacturing things. Solar panel companies, how do we generate those? Chip manufacturings, how do we generate those? I'm going to end that video there because now the video goes on to, he's being targeted by the CIA for something that people have kind of, if you pay attention, or you're a bank president or something you've known forever, and a whole host of other things. And I'd like to point out, just because he's good at economics and he has a good idea, he does seem to, his other ideas don't necessarily mean they're just as brilliant. He goes on in this, I'm not going to play it, but he does go on in this weird, like, NATO occupied Europe. What? The Allies occupied Europe. NATO is Europe. He does seem to have some German grievance, which is a little policy of the Fed and the West and everything else to hurt these ties between Germany and Russia. Okay, nobody needs to hurt the ties between Germany and Russia. Y'all have been fighting for centuries, literally centuries. So, chill, dude. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I do think he's a brilliant guy. I actually think he's absolutely right on his economic theory. It's just there's all the things around it. Right idea. It's one of those things. Who am I to argue with a guy who's clearly very, very smart, went to Oxford and everything else? But I would wager he's never spent time in a small town bank. Maybe he has. I could be very wrong, but it just doesn't seem that way. And Tucker Carlson, I mean, my opinion on him is, if he's ever swung a hammer, I'd be surprised. So have a good night. Thanks.